Ever feel like you're drowning in information these days?
It's a common feeling for sure.
I know I do. There's just so much data coming at us from all directions.
Absolutely.
It can be completely overwhelming. But today we're diving into a study that's tackling this problem head on.
Okay.
And get this, they're using machine learning to find the most efficient ways to describe complex systems.
This sounds intriguing.
It's like finding the hidden structure in the chaos, which I'm all for.
It's a fascinating approach, really.
Yeah.
Think of it like creating a compressed version of a complex system where you retain the essential information without getting bogged down in every single detail.
Right.
The study we're looking at is called, and I'll try to say this correctly, Surveying the Space of Descriptions of a Composite System with Machine Learning.
Catchy.
And it dives into some pretty interesting areas.
Oh.
From physics to Sudoku puzzles.
Wow.
Even to language.
Okay, so we're talking about simplifying these systems without losing the important stuff. But what exactly is a description in this context? It sounds kind of abstract.
Well, imagine a system like a network of interacting spins.
Okay.
Those tiny magnets that can be either up or down.
Right.
A description could tell you something about the state of each spin.
Maybe
not the exact state, but something like whether it's more likely to be up or down.
Okay.
Or how its state is related to the states of other spins.
So it's like a summary
that
captures the key relationships.
Exactly.
Without needing to know every single value.
Yes. And the beauty of this study is that they use machine learning to find the most insightful descriptions.
Sure.
Traditional methods for analyzing these systems can be really computationally expensive.
Right.
Especially for large systems. But machine learning gives us a way to navigate that complexity much more efficiently.
That makes sense. So how does machine learning actually help us find these descriptions?
Well, it's tricky.
Yeah.
It seems like finding the best way to summarize a system could be a really hard problem. You're absolutely right. It is a hard problem.
Okay.
That's where the space of descriptions comes in.
Right.
Imagine all the possible ways you could summarize a system that's the space they're exploring.
Okay.
And it's a vast space with tons of possibilities.
So it's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Yes.
Trying to find the most informative description among all the possible ones.
Exactly. And machine learning acts like a powerful metal detector.
Okay.
Helping us sift through that haystack and find the descriptions that really stand out.
I like that analogy.
They do this by focusing on certain information-theoretic quantities, like total correlation and O information.
All right, let's break those down.
Here.
I have a feeling those terms are going to be crucial for understanding this whole thing.
They are important, yes.
What exactly is total correlation?
Essentially, total correlation measures how much information you gain by looking at all the components of a system together, as opposed to looking at them individually. It tells you how integrated the system is, how much the components depend on each other.
So a high total correlation means the parts are really interconnected.
Yes, that's a great analogy.
Kind of like a tightly knit team where everyone relies on everyone else.
And conversely, a low total correlation would suggest the parts are more independent.
Right.
Each doing their own thing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So total correlation gives us a sense of how intertwined the components are. What about O information?
Okay.
That sounds even more mysterious.
O information is fascinating because it tells us about the nature of the interactions between components.
Okay.
It distinguishes between two key types of relationships, redundancy and synergy.
Redundancy and synergy.
Yeah.
Those sound familiar from other contexts, but how do they apply to complex systems?
Think of redundancy like having multiple backups of the same information.
Okay.
If one component fails, you can still get the information from another component. It's like having a spare tire in your car. You don't need it all the time, but it's there if you need it.
Okay, so redundancy is about overlapping information.
Yeah.
Kind of like a safety net.
Yes.
What about synergy?
Synergy is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
It means that the information emerges from the combination of components.
Right.
You can't get the full picture just by looking at the parts individually.
Okay.
You need to see them interacting together.
So synergy is about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly.
It's like in a musical band, each instrument contributes something unique, but it's the combination that creates the magic.
And O information quantifies these relationships.
Right.
A high O information indicates more redundancy,
Right.
while a low O information suggests more synergy.
Got it. So by finding descriptions that maximize or minimize these quantities,
Yes.
total correlation and O information,
Right.
we can uncover the most important relationships within a system.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like shining a spotlight on the key connections and interactions.
And that's precisely what they do in this study.
Okay.
They apply this approach to 3 different systems,
All right.
each with its own unique challenges and insights.
Okay.
The first one they tackle is a spin system,
All right.
a classic example in physics.
Okay, so we're going from abstract concepts to a real-world example.
Yes.
What kind of spin system did they look at?
They chose a simple system with 5 interacting spins,
Okay.
kind of like tiny magnets that can be either up or down.
Uh-huh.
Some of these spins have what's called ferromagnetic coupling, meaning they tend to align in the same direction, like 2 magnets attracting each other.
So those spins are kind of like best friends, always wanting to be in sync.
Exactly. But then they also have some spins with antiferromagnetic coupling, which means they prefer to align in opposite directions.
Ah, so some of the spins are a bit more rebellious, wanting to go their own way. That creates a system with both cooperation and conflict.
Yes.
Seems a lot like real life.
Indeed. And by applying their machine learning approach, they were able to find the descriptions that maximized or minimized total correlation and O information in this STIN system.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did those descriptions reveal about the system?
Well,
did they align with what we might expect intuitively?
They did, in some ways.
Okay.
For example, the descriptions that maximized total correlation, meaning they highlighted the most integrated points of the system, tended to link together the spins with ferromagnetic couplings.
Okay.
The ones that wanted to align in the same direction.
Makes sense. Those spins are working together.
Right.
So their information is more tightly bound.
Exactly.
It's like a close-knit group where everyone's on the same page.
Precisely. And conversely, the descriptions that minimized total correlation connected the spins that were furthest apart, or had those conflicting antiferromagnetic couplings.
Right.
They were the most independent, contributing less to the overall integration of the system.
So it's like identifying the loners in the group.
Yes.
The ones who prefer to do their own thing.
Right.
This is already giving us a way to map out the relationships within a system.
It is.
Even if we don't know all the details of how those relationships work.
Exactly. And the O information analysis added another layer of insight.
Okay.
The descriptions that maximized redundancy, those with the most overlapping information, again linked the ferromagnetically coupled spins, those friendly magnets.
So the information about those spins is kind of redundant, like having multiple backups of the same file.
Precisely. But the descriptions that minimized O information, the most synergistic ones, linked the spins in what's called a frustrated triangle.
Frustrated triangle.
This is a situation where it's physically impossible for all the couplings to be satisfied simultaneously.
Okay, so it's like a love triangle where everyone can't be happy at the same time.
Exactly.
There's inherent tension and unpredictability built into the system.
And that's where synergy shines. It highlights the parts of the system where the outcome is not a simple sum of the individual contributions.
Okay.
The whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts.
Wow, this is really starting to click.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, when I first glanced at the paper, the math looked pretty intense. Can we break down some of those equations?
Sure.
See how they actually implement these ideas?
Absolutely. The math can seem daunting.
It did to me.
But it's actually quite elegant once you understand the core concepts.
Okay, good.
Let's start with how they represent a description mathematically. They view each description as a collection of communication channels, one for each component of the system.
So it's like each component has its own dedicated line for sending information?
Yes.
But we don't have to send all the information. Right. We're being selective about what we transmit.
Precisely. And the amount of information you send about each component is measured by what's called the mutual information between the component and its channel. They denote this as IEE, where she represents the component, like a specific spin. And E represents the information being transmitted about that component through its channel.
So UI is essentially the description of G.
Yes.
And the more information we send, the higher the mutual information.
Right.
It's like a stronger signal being transmitted.
Exactly. Now, to calculate quantities like total correlation and O information for a given description, they need to estimate these mutual information values. For the component-wise information, the IEU we just discussed, they use a clever technique called a lower bound based on likelihood ratios.
Lower bound likelihood ratios. Those sound a bit technical. Can you explain those in a way that doesn't require a PhD in statistics?
Of course. Think of it like this. A likelihood ratio compares a probability of seeing certain outcomes under different conditions.
Right.
In this case, they're looking at how much the information being transmitted that way changes the likelihood of observing different values for the component xi.
So it's a way to measure how informative the description is.
Exactly.
How much it helps us predict the state of the component.
Exactly. By comparing probabilities, they can get a direct estimate of how much information is being conveyed by the description.
Right.
But that only covers the component-wise information for the terms that involve multiple components, which are crucial for calculating total correlation and O information.
Right.
Things get a bit more complex.
Ah, yes, because those terms are capturing the relationships between components.
Yes.
Not just the information about individual components. How do they handle that?
That's where a powerful technique called info-NC comes in.
Info-NC.
Which stands for noise contrastive estimation.
It's a method for estimating mutual information using neural networks.
Neural networks. I knew those would come into play at some point. But how do you use a neural network to estimate something like mutual information?
It's quite ingenious, really.
Yeah.
They train two neural networks. One to encode the first variable in the mutual information term, and another to encode the second variable. Both networks learn to map their inputs into a shared representation space, where the similarity between the encoded representations can be measured.
So it's like the networks are learning a common language for representing the variables.
Precisely.
A language that captures their relationship to each other.
And the key to InfoNC is the way it trains these networks. It uses a special loss function that contrasts positive pairs of samples where the variables come from the same data point against negative pairs where they come from different data points.
This teaches the networks to distinguish between genuine relationships and random noise.
So the networks are learning to pick out the true signal from the noise. By comparing real pairs with random pairs. It's like a game of spot the difference, but for data.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And this makes InfoNC a very efficient and robust way to estimate mutual information, even for complex, high-dimensional data sets.
This is all incredibly clever.
So by combining these different techniques, the lower bound based on likelihood ratios and InfoNC, they have a complete toolkit for estimating all the mutual information terms they need.
And with those estimates in hand, they can now search through that vast space of descriptions to find the ones that maximize or minimize total correlation and O information.
Okay, so we've got our metal detector and we're ready to start searching for those hidden gems in the haystack of descriptions.
But before we go any further, I want to step back for a moment. Make sure we're all clear on why we're doing this in the first place. What's the big payoff?
That's a crucial question.
What can these extreme descriptions tell us about a system that we wouldn't know otherwise?
And I think one of the most exciting aspects of this approach is its ability to identify the key players and relationships within a complex system, even if we don't fully understand the underlying mechanisms.
Unpack that for us. What do you mean by key players?
By finding the descriptions that maximize total correlation, we're essentially pinpointing the groups of components that are most integrated, most tightly bound in their information. These are the parts of the system that are working together most effectively, like the core team members in a successful project.
So it's like a way to map out the power structure of a system to see where the real influence lies.
Precisely. And conversely, the descriptions that minimize total correlation highlight the components that are most independent, least influenced by the rest of the system.
Interesting.
These are the mavericks, the ones who operate outside the main network.
So it's not just about identifying the core.
It's not.
But also about understanding the periphery.
Yes.
The parts that are less connected but might still play an important role.
Exactly. And the O information analysis adds another dimension to this understanding. The descriptions that maximize O information, meaning they are most redundant, tell us which parts of the system are conveying overlapping information.
So it's like identifying the system's built-in redundancy, the backup mechanisms that ensure robustness.
Exactly. And the descriptions that minimize O information, the most synergistic ones, highlight the parts of the system where the whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts.
So these are the parts of the system where the most complex and unpredictable behavior is likely to emerge. where the magic happens.
Precisely. And this is where the potential for discovering new scientific insights is really exciting.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense.
Good.
But I'm eager to see how this plays out in practice.
Okay.
I know the study goes on to explore 2 more case studies.
They do.
Sudoku puzzles and patterns and letter sequences, and I'm curious to see how those examples bring these abstract concepts to life.
I agree. Those case studies are where things get really interesting.
Right.
They show how this framework can be applied to systems that are very different from each other,
Right.
yet still reveal underlying patterns of information flow.
All right. Well, I can't wait to dive into those.
Yeah.
But for now, I think we've covered a lot of ground and laid a solid foundation for understanding this fascinating approach to describing complex systems.
I agree. We've explored the key concepts,
Yeah.
mathematical framework,
Right.
and even dipped our toes into the spin system example.
We did.
I think we're well equipped to tackle those case studies head on.
I'm ready.
Welcome back. Are you ready to see how these ideas about descriptions and information theory play out in some real-world examples?
Absolutely. We've laid the groundwork, and now I'm eager to see how this all comes together. I know one of the case studies involves Sudoku puzzles,
It does.
which seems like a fun and unexpected choice.
It is a fun one. Sudoku puzzles, with their strict rules and interconnected squares,
Right.
are a fantastic example of a system with dense constraints.
Okay.
Each square's value depends on the values in multiple other squares, creating a web of intricate relationships.
Right. It's a microcosm of a complex system,
It is.
but one that we can all relate to.
Yes.
So how did they apply this description approach to Sudoku?
They focused on finding descriptions that maximized or minimized the O information
Okay.
between Sudoku squares,
Right.
which, as we discussed earlier, reveals the most redundant or synergistic relationships
Right.
between those squares.
And just to remind everyone, redundancy means the information in one part of the system overlaps with information in another part,
Right.
while synergy means the information emerges from the combination of parts.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they find when they applied this to Sudoku?
It's fascinating, really. They discovered that the descriptions with the highest O information,
Okay.
the most redundant ones,
Right.
were actually quite intuitive. They're essentially communicating the same partial information about every square on the board.
Okay, so instead of giving specific clues about individual squares,
Right.
these descriptions were highlighting the global rules of Sudoku,
Yes.
the constraints that apply to every square.
Yeah.
Like saying, okay, here's how Sudoku works in general,
Exactly.
but not giving away any specific solutions.
And these high-O information descriptions started by distinguishing one number
Okay.
from the other 3 possibilities in each square,
Right.
and then gradually increased the amount of information
Okay.
until they reached complete information about every square,
Right.
essentially revealing the solution to the puzzle step by step.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like progressively zooming in on the solution, revealing more and more detail with each step. But what about the opposite end of the spectrum? What did the descriptions with the lowest O information, the most synergistic ones, look like?
No, those were much more intriguing
Okay.
and less intuitive.
Right.
They revealed these intricate patterns of partial information
Uh-huh.
that went beyond simply looking at subsets of squares.
Okay.
These descriptions couldn't be easily explained by just pointing to specific rows, columns, or 3x3 blocks.
Okay.
They were capturing something deeper about the relationships between squares.
So these synergistic descriptions were uncovering these hidden dependencies between squares
Yes.
that you wouldn't necessarily notice just by glancing at the puzzle.
Right.
It's like they were revealing the underlying logic of Sudoku,
Exactly.
the subtle connections that make it so challenging.
Precisely. And to visualize these synergistic descriptions,
Okay.
they used a technique called hardening.
Hardening.
Essentially.
What does that mean in this context?
They took the soft, probabilistic descriptions generated by the machine learning algorithm, which might say something like, there's a 60% chance this square is a 3,
Right.
and converted them into hard clusters of values,
Okay.
where each square would be assigned a definite set of possibilities.
Okay, so instead of having probabilities,
Yeah.
you'd end up with statements like,
Right.
this square could be a 1, a 4, or a 7, but definitely not any other number.
Exactly.
It's like simplifying the description while still retaining the essential relationships.
This hardening allowed them to visualize which possible values in each square were grouped together
Okay.
by the description,
Right.
making it easier to see the patterns that were emerging.
And what did these hardened synergistic descriptions reveal? Did they find any interesting structures?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the patterns were incredibly intricate.
Okay.
showing complex relationships between squares that were distributed across rows columns and those smaller 3x3 blocks within the puzzle.
Right.
It was like the machine learning algorithm was uncovering a hidden language within the Sudoku puzzle, a language of constraints and dependencies that governs how the numbers relate to each other.
That's amazing. So they weren't just finding solutions to the puzzle.
Right.
They were uncovering the deeper structure.
Exactly.
The underlying principles that make Sudoku work.
And one of the most striking findings was that the most synergistic description they found exhibited a beautiful symmetry across the diagonal of the board.
Wow.
It was like the machine learning algorithm had uncovered a hidden aesthetic principle within the puzzle. A sense of balance and harmony that we might not have noticed otherwise.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like the algorithm found a kind of beauty in the math.
Yes.
A hidden elegance in the way the constraints interacted. It makes me wonder if there are similar hidden symmetries in other complex systems just waiting to be discovered.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights the potential of this approach to reveal unexpected structures and patterns in the world around us.
Okay, this is all mind-blowing. But I have to ask, how practical is this?
Well,
Sudoku boards are relatively small.
They are.
Can we really scale this approach to much larger, more complex systems?
That's a valid concern, even for a relatively small 4x4 Sudoku board.
Okay.
The number of possible hardened descriptions is astronomical, over 10 to the power of 18.
Wow.
Trying to manually search through all those possibilities would be impossible, even with the fastest computers.
Yeah, that's a number bigger than the number of stars in the Milky Way. It's like searching for a specific grain of sand on all the beaches of the world.
Exactly. But that's where the power of machine learning really shines.
Yep.
The algorithms they used were able to efficiently navigate that vast base of descriptions and find those extremal ones.
Yeah.
Those with the highest and lowest O information in just a few minutes.
Wow, that's incredible. So this approach really can scale to larger, more complex systems.
It can.
It's not just a theoretical curiosity.
Yeah.
It has real-world potential.
It absolutely does. And that's what makes it so promising for a wide range of applications.
Oh, like what?
From analyzing social networks and financial markets to understanding the interactions between genes in our DNA or the dynamics of ecosystems.
Okay, that's really exciting. So we've seen how this description framework can be applied to a system with strict deterministic rules like Sudoku.
We have.
But I know the study also looks at a very different kind of system, the statistics of 4 grams in the English language. What makes language a good system to study with this approach?
Language is fascinating because it's full of patterns and dependencies, but it's also incredibly flexible and nuanced. Unlike Sudoku, which has rigid rules, language has probabilistic constraints. The likelihood of a particular letter or word appearing depends on the context, the surrounding letters and words.
Language is all about meaning and interpretation, which makes it much more slippery than a system like Sudoku. So how did they apply the description framework to something as fluid as language?
They focus on 4 grams, sequences of 4 letters that were either 4-letter words themselves or segments of 8-letter words. They then used their machine learning approach to find descriptions that maximized and minimized the O information between the letters in those 4 grams.
So they were essentially looking at how information is shared and structured?
They were.
Within these small units of language, these 4-letter building blocks.
Yes.
And I imagine they found some pretty interesting results.
They did.
Given the difference between 4-letter words and segments of longer words.
What they found was that the O information, that balance between redundancy and synergy, varied significantly, depending on whether the 4-gram was a word itself or just a part of a longer word. For those 4 grams extracted from 8-letter words, the descriptions were almost entirely synergistic. Meaning the information was truly emerging from the combination of letters.
So knowing the individual letters wouldn't tell you much about the sequence. You needed to see the letters together in their specific order. To understand the information they were conveying.
Exactly.
It's like the meaning is embedded in the relationship between the letters.
Yes.
Not in the letters themselves.
This suggests that the relationships between letters within longer words are much more complex and interdependent than within shorter standalone words. There's a kind of syntactic and semantic glue that binds the letters together in a longer word, creating a unit of meaning that's greater than the sum of its parts.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like the meaning of a four-gram within a longer word is more tightly bound to its context.
Right.
While the meaning of a four-letter word is more self-contained.
Precisely. But even for those four-letter words, they found that the descriptions exhibited a mixture of redundancy and synergy.
All right.
It wasn't purely one or the other.
Okay.
This suggests that some information about those four-letter words could be gleaned from individual letters, perhaps their frequency in the English language,
right,
or their typical position within a word.
Okay.
But other information emerged only when you saw the letters combined in their specific order.
Okay, so there's more predictability in four-letter words
There is.
than in those four-gram segments of longer words.
Yes.
But still, there's an element of surprise, an emergence of meaning that goes beyond simply adding up the contributions of the individual letters.
Exactly. And another fascinating finding was that the space of descriptions for these four-grams wasn't symmetrical, around 0 O information.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the most redundant descriptions, those with the highest O information, were less redundant than the most synergistic descriptions were synergistic. In other words, the potential for synergy, for information to emerge from the combination of letters, was greater than the potential for redundancy, for information to be replicated across individual letters.
Interesting. So even within these small units of language, these four-grams, there's a bias toward synergy, toward the creation of new meaning through the combination of elements. That's like language itself is inherently geared toward innovation and the generation of new ideas.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it highlights how this approach can reveal these subtle asymmetries and biases in the way information is structured within a system. It's not just about identifying the connections, it's about understanding the nature of those connections, the balance between redundancy and synergy, and how that balance shapes the overall behavior of the system.
All this talk about descriptions is making me picture these abstract patterns. These flows of information between letters. But how did they actually visualize these descriptions for the four-grams? Did they use that hardening technique again like they did with Sudoku?
They did. And just like with Sudoku, they converted the soft probabilistic descriptions into hard clusters of letters. This allowed them to see which letters were consistently grouped together by the descriptions, providing a visual representation of those information dependencies.
So instead of saying, this letter has a 70% chance of being a vowel, they would say, this letter is either a vowel or it's not. And then they would group the vowels together and the consonants together.
Exactly. And these hardened descriptions revealed some really interesting patterns. For example, in one of the descriptions that minimized O information, the letters Q and U were always grouped together. Which makes perfect sense.
It does.
Given how often they appear together in English words.
It's like the algorithm rediscovered the Q digraph. That inseparable pair of letters that always stick together.
It highlights how this approach can capture those really strong dependencies between letters, those linguistic rules that we often take for granted.
This is all fascinating. We're seeing these intriguing patterns emerge in language.
We are.
Just like we did with Sudoku. Even though these are such different systems. But again, I'm wondering about the practical side of things. There are 26 letters in the alphabet. So the number of possible descriptions for even a four-gram must be astronomical. How can they possibly explore that vast space?
You're right. The number of possible descriptions is mind-boggling.
It is.
For a single letter. There are already over 10 to the power of 19 possible hardened descriptions. And with 4 letters in a four-gram, the number becomes truly unfathomable. More combinations than there are atoms in the human body.
So we're back to needing that superpowered metal detector. Brute force searching is clearly not an option here.
Exactly. Once again, machine learning is the only way to feasibly explore this vast space of descriptions. The algorithms they used were able to efficiently sift through those trillions upon trillions of possibilities and find those descriptions that maximized or minimized O information, revealing those hidden patterns in the structure of language.
This is all incredible. We've gone from spin systems to Sudoku puzzles to the intricacies of the English language, and it's clear that this description framework has the potential to unlock insights in all sorts of complex systems.
It does.
But I'm also wondering, where do we go from here?
Okay.
What are the limitations of this approach? Yeah. And what are the exciting new directions it might lead to?
Those are fantastic questions.
Yeah.
And I think they point to the most important aspects of this research,
Right.
its potential and its limitations.
Right.
We've seen how powerful this approach can be.
We have.
But it's also important to acknowledge that it's still a relatively new area of research.
Yeah.
There's a lot we don't yet know about how to interpret these descriptions.
Right.
How to extract the most meaningful insights from them.
Okay.
And scaling this approach to even larger, more complex systems will require further advances in both machine learning algorithms and computational resources.
Right.
Imagine trying to apply this framework to the entire global financial market.
Right.
Or the complex network of interactions within a human cell. Those are incredibly challenging computational tasks.
So it's like we've built a fantastic telescope.
Yes.
But we're still trying to figure out how to point it at the most distant galaxies.
Right.
The potential is there, but we need to keep pushing the boundaries of what's computationally feasible.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this research so exciting.
Yeah.
It's a glimpse into a future where we can use machine learning to navigate the vast complexity of the world around us.
Right.
And uncover the hidden structures that govern everything.
Okay.
From the smallest physical systems to the grandest cosmic phenomena.
Okay, that's an inspiring thought. But before we get carried away with future possibilities,
Sure.
I want to loop back to something you mentioned earlier, the connection between this research and how our brains work. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. One of the most intriguing aspects of this study is that it sheds light on how we, as humans, make sense of complexity.
Okay.
We're constantly bombarded with information.
We are.
But our brains have limited capacity to process it all.
Right.
So we have to be selective.
Okay.
We have to focus on certain aspects of a situation while ignoring others.
Right.
And what this research suggests is that this selective attention, this ability to find the most informative descriptions, might not just be a limitation, but a crucial aspect of intelligence itself.
So our brains are, in a sense, already doing this description process all the time, filtering out the noise and focusing on the signal.
Yes.
The essential information that allows us to understand and interact with the world.
I believe so. And this opens up some really exciting questions.
Oh.
Can we use this framework to better understand how our brains learn and make decisions? Can we design artificial intelligence systems that mimic this selective attention? This ability to find the most informative descriptions to become more efficient and adaptable?
Those are fantastic questions. It seems like this research is just the beginning of a whole new way of thinking about complex systems.
I think so.
Both natural and artificial. And our place within them. But we've covered so much ground today.
We have.
And I think our listeners' brains, including mine, could use a little break to process all this amazing information.
I agree. A mental recharge is always a good idea.
It is.
Let's take a moment to absorb all these insights. And when we come back,
all right,
we'll delve into the broader implications of this research. And explore some of those tantalizing questions about the future.
Okay, we're back and ready to continue our deep dive. We've explored how this description framework can be applied to a diverse range of systems.
We have.
From the rigid structure of Sudoku to the fluidity of language. It's really highlighted the power of information theory and machine learning to uncover hidden patterns. But now I'm curious about the bigger picture. What are the broader implications of this research? And where might it lead us in the future?
Those are the key questions, aren't they?
They are?
We've seen how powerful this approach can be for understanding specific systems. But I think one of the most significant implications is its potential to bridge the gap between different scientific disciplines.
Okay, that's intriguing. How does this approach connect different fields? It seems like we've already jumped between physics and linguistics in this episode.
Exactly. And that's just scratching the surface. The beauty of this framework is that it's incredibly general. It's not tied to any specific type of system. Whether you're studying the interactions between neurons in the brain, the dynamics of a financial market, or the spread of information in a social network. You can apply this description approach to understand how information is structured and how the components relate to each other.
So it's like a universal language for analyzing complex systems.
Precisely.
A way to see the common threads that run through seemingly disparate fields.
And this opens up the possibility for a cross-fertilization of ideas and insights.
Right.
For example, the patterns they found in the O information of Sudoku puzzles
Right.
might inspire new ways to design algorithms for solving similar constraint satisfaction problems in computer science.
Okay.
Or the insights from analyzing 4 grams in language could inform the development of more sophisticated natural language processing models.
So it's not just about understanding existing systems.
It's not.
But also about using those insights to design and optimize new systems, whether they're artificial intelligence algorithms or new approaches to solving complex social problems.
Absolutely. It's about using the principles of information flow and complexity to approach problems from a new perspective, to see connections that might have been hidden before.
Okay, this is really exciting. But I also know that every new approach has its limitations.
Of course.
What are some of the challenges or open questions that remain with this description framework?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest challenges is interpretability.
Okay.
While machine learning algorithms are incredibly powerful at finding these optimal descriptions, understanding why those descriptions are optimal, what they truly represent about the system can still be a challenge.
So it's like having a powerful tool that gives you answers.
Yes.
But you're not always sure how to interpret those answers in a meaningful way.
Right.
It's like getting a cryptic message from a fortune cookie.
Yeah.
You know, there's something profound in there, but you're not quite sure how to decode it.
That's a great analogy. And that's where human intuition and domain expertise still play a crucial role.
Okay.
We need to combine the power of machine learning with our own understanding of the specific system.
Right.
We're studying to make sense of the patterns that emerge.
It's a partnership between human and machine.
It is.
Each bringing their strengths to the table.
Right.
The machine can explore vast spaces of possibilities.
Yes.
While the human can provide the context and meaning.
Exactly.
The aha moments that connect the dots.
And I think that's what makes this research so exciting.
Yeah.
It's not about replacing human understanding with machine intelligence.
Okay.
It's about using machines to augment our own abilities, to see things we couldn't see before.
All right, so interpretability is one challenge.
It is.
Are there other limitations we should be aware of?
Another key challenge is scalability.
Okay.
While the study demonstrated this approach on relatively small systems, like a 5-spin system or a Sudoku puzzle, applying it to truly massive real-world systems with millions or billions of components will require further advances in both machine learning algorithms and computational resources.
Okay.
Imagine trying to apply this framework to the entire global financial market or the complex network of interactions within a human cell.
Wow.
Those are incredibly challenging computational tasks.
So it's like we've built a fantastic telescope, but we're still trying to figure out how to point it at the most distant galaxies.
Exactly.
The potential is there.
It is.
But we need to keep pushing the boundaries of what's computationally feasible.
And I think that's what makes this research so exciting.
Yeah.
It's a glimpse into a future where we can use machine learning to navigate the vast complexity of the world around us and uncover the hidden structures that govern everything from the smallest physical systems to the grandest cosmic phenomena.
Okay, that's an inspiring thought. But before we get carried away with future possibilities, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. The connection between this research and how our brains work. It seems like there's a profound resonance between this idea of finding the most informative descriptions and how our brains process information in a world that's constantly bombarding us with sensory input. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. One of the key insights from this study is that the most relevant descriptions of a system often involve focusing on specific partial information about each component rather than trying to process every detail simultaneously. And this aligns beautifully with how our brains operate. We have limited cognitive resources, so we're constantly filtering information and focusing on the most salient aspects of a situation.
It's like our brains are already doing a version of this description process all the time.
Exactly.
Prioritizing and selecting the information that's most relevant for our survival and our ability to navigate the world.
Precisely. And this research suggests that this selective attention might not be a limitation, but an essential feature of intelligence itself. By focusing on specific aspects of a system
Okay.
by finding those informative descriptions.
Right.
We can uncover patterns and make decisions that wouldn't be possible if we tried to process everything at once.
So our brains are, in a sense, masters of simplification.
Yes.
Finding those elegant summaries of reality that allow us to make sense of the complexity around us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And this opens up some really intriguing questions.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Can we use this framework to design artificial intelligence systems that mimic this human ability to focus on the essential information?
Right.
To become more efficient and adaptable learners?
Right.
Can we use it to better understand how our own brains learn and make decisions to unlock the secrets of human cognition?
Those are fantastic questions. It seems like this research is just the beginning of a whole new way of thinking about complex systems, both natural and artificial.
I agree.
And our place within them.
I completely agree. Remember, the study itself ends with a provocative question.
Yeah, Bassett.
Could this approach, which focuses on describing a system, be used to predict how a system might evolve or change over time?
Wow, that's a mind-blowing possibility. If we can identify the most informative descriptions of a system, could we use those descriptions to forecast its future behavior? Could we predict the spread of a disease, the fluctuations of a financial market, or even the evolution of a language?
Yeah.
All based on these underlying patterns of information flow.
It's a question that's ripe for exploration.
It is.
And if we can crack that code,
Yeah.
the implications for science, technology, and our understanding of the world would be profound.
Absolutely.
But it also raises important ethical considerations.
Right.
If we develop the ability to predict these complex systems with increasing accuracy,
Okay.
we have a responsibility to use that knowledge wisely and ethically.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Okay.
And what an incredible journey it's been. We've explored the power of descriptions to unlock the hidden structures within complex systems.
We have.
We've marveled at the elegance of information theory and the power of machine learning.
Yes.
And we've glimpsed the exciting possibilities that this approach opens up for science, technology, and even our understanding of ourselves.
It's been a true pleasure delving into this research with you.
Likewise.
It's clear that we're just at the beginning of this exploration, and I'm eager to see what new discoveries await us in this vast and intricate web of complex systems that make up our world.
Listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and left you with plenty to ponder. As always, we encourage you to explore the source material further.
Absolutely.
Delve into the math and see what insights you can uncover. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking those big questions, and keep exploring the fascinating world of complexity that surrounds us. Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today, things are going to get pretty complex, literally. We're tackling complex systems. But we're not just skimming the surface this time.
Right.
We're going deep down to the informational roots.
I love it.
Exploring how information shapes these systems at their very core.
It's like, you know how you can describe something like a city skyline?
All right.
On like a really broad level, just the overall shape and all, but then you can also zoom in. You can describe the individual buildings and the streets, the people moving around, you know.
I see what you're saying.
Each description gives you a totally different perspective on the city.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about the paper we're diving into today.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
It's called Surveying the Space of Descriptions of a Composite System with Machine Learning.
Get you.
And they're using machine learning to explore these descriptions, seeing how they can uncover hidden patterns in complex systems.
So they're basically saying that the way we describe a system can totally change how we understand it.
Exactly. It's like using different lenses to examine a gem, each revealing unique facets of its structure.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And get this, they're not just describing these systems, they're quantifying how information is structured within those descriptions.
Whoa, hold on.
I know, right?
How do you even begin to measure something like that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. They're using some heavy-duty tools from information theory, specifically Shannon entropy.
Okay, I'm familiar with Shannon entropy, but for our listeners who might not be, could you give us a quick rundown?
For sure.
Awesome.
So imagine you're trying to describe a system. It could be anything, a network of neurons, a stock market, even something as simple as a group of interacting particles.
Right.
A description in this context is essentially a way of capturing the essential information about that system.
Okay, but isn't that kind of subjective? What one person considers essential might be different for someone else.
That's true. And that's where Shannon entropy comes in. It gives us a mathematical way to quantify the amount of information contained in a message.
So in this case, the message is our description of the system.
Exactly. And the more information a description preserves, the more detailed and complex it becomes.
But more complex doesn't always mean better.
Definitely not.
Right.
Sometimes a simpler description can be more useful, especially if we're trying to understand the big picture.
It's like compressing a file on your computer.
Oh, yeah.
You can choose how much detail to preserve.
Right.
A high-quality compression keeps more information.
Like a super detailed description.
Exactly. But it also takes up more space.
While a lossy compression throws away some data for the sake of efficiency.
Like a more simplified description.
Exactly. And the key is to find the right balance between detail and simplicity, depending on what we're trying to achieve.
Makes sense. But how does this all tie back to complex systems? How does analyzing these descriptions help us understand these systems better?
That's where things get even more fascinating. The paper argues that by analyzing these descriptions, we can gain a deeper understanding of how information is organized within a complex system.
Interesting.
And they propose using two key measures for this.
Hit me.
Total correlation and O information.
Okay, let's take those one by one.
Sounds good to me.
What is total correlation?
Total correlation basically measures how interconnected the different parts of a system are.
So how much they depend on each other.
Exactly. The higher the total correlation, the more intertwined the components are.
Okay.
Meaning you can't truly understand one part without considering all the others.
So like a tightly woven tapestry.
Oh, I like that.
Where each thread contributes to the overall pattern.
Perfect analogy. Now, O information is a little more tricky to wrap your head around.
Oh boy.
It tells us whether the information in a system is primarily redundant or synergistic.
Redundant or synergistic? Okay.
Yeah, think of redundant information like having several thermometers.
Okay.
All measuring the same room, all reporting the same temperature.
So it's like having multiple copies of the same file on your computer.
You got it. You only really need one.
Gotcha.
Now, synergistic information
Yeah.
is where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay.
You need to consider the interactions between components to get the full picture.
Like a complex chemical reaction.
Exactly. You can't just look at the individual molecules in isolation.
You need to see how they interact with each other.
Yeah.
How those interactions create emergent properties that wouldn't exist otherwise.
It's not just about knowing the ingredients. It's about understanding the recipe.
I'm with you.
And how those ingredients come together to create something totally new.
I like it.
And the researchers believe that by analyzing the total correlation and O information of different descriptions of a system, we can gain valuable insights into its underlying structure and how information flows within it.
This is getting really interesting.
Right. But the problem is,
What's that?
this space of possible descriptions is absolutely enormous.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine.
It's like trying to find the most interesting arrangement of puzzle pieces out of trillions of combinations.
Talk about a needle in a haystack.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where machine learning comes into play.
Ah, so that's how they're navigating this massive space of descriptions.
Exactly. They're using powerful machine learning techniques.
Like what?
Specifically neural networks.
Okay.
To efficiently search for descriptions that either maximize or minimize these information-theoretic measures.
So it's like having a superpowered magnifying glass.
I like that.
That can sift through mountains of data and pinpoint the most insightful descriptions of a complex system.
Exactly. And they've applied this approach to 3 very different case studies.
Okay, enlighten me.
A simple physical system of interacting magnets, which they call a spin system, the highly structured world of Sudoku boards,
Interesting choice.
and the incredibly complex realm of language.
Wow.
Specifically analyzing sequences of letters in English text.
This is awesome. So where do we start? Which case study are we diving into first?
Let's start with the spin systems. Can you tell us more about what they did with those?
Absolutely. In their spin system example, they explored a system with 5 interacting magnets, some attracting and some repelling. What's remarkable is that they found different descriptions highlighted different aspects of the system's structure.
So it's like they were using different filters to view the same system?
Yeah.
Each revealing unique patterns of interaction between the magnets?
Precisely. For example, descriptions based on simply grouping spins together weren't always the most informative.
Interesting.
It suggests that there are more nuanced ways to describe the relationships between these magnets than just saying, these three are connected.
Fascinating. It's like they're challenging the conventional way of thinking about these systems,
Right.
pushing beyond simple classifications to uncover deeper layers of organization.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning. Their work with Sudoku boards and English text reveals even more intriguing insights.
I can't wait to hear about those. But before we move on,
Sure.
can you remind me again how these descriptions actually work? What are they made of?
Of course. It's important to remember that these descriptions are not just words or labels.
Right.
They are mathematical constructs that represent how information is distributed within a system.
So can you give us a more concrete example of what one of these descriptions might look like?
Sure. Imagine you're describing a simple system with 4 components.
Got it.
Labeled A, B, C, and D.
Right.
A description might specify that components A and B are highly correlated, while C and D are independent of each other and of A and B.
So it's like a blueprint that outlines the informational connections within the system.
Exactly. And this blueprint can be represented mathematically using tools from information theory, like conditional entropy and mutual information.
Got it. So it was all about understanding how information is structured and shared within a system.
Yeah.
And using those insights to build a more complete picture of how it functions.
Precisely. And the exciting part is that these insights can be applied to systems of all kinds.
Right.
From simple physical models to the complexities of human language.
This is mind-blowing stuff. I'm eager to hear more about how they apply this framework to Sudoku boards and English text.
Me too.
But I think we need to take a break for now.
Sure.
And let our listener digest all this amazing information.
Sounds good to me. Let's pick up where we left off next time.
All right, welcome back. That last discussion was intense.
It really makes you think about how much we can learn about a system just by looking at how the information inside it is structured.
I'm with you there. And I'm dying to hear about how the researchers applied this to those other case studies.
Oh, yeah, the Sudoku and the English text.
Exactly. Let's start with Sudoku.
Okay, sure.
What makes it so interesting for this kind of analysis?
Well, Sudoku boards are fascinating because they're so constrained, you know?
Right, the rules.
Yeah, like you can't have the same number in a row, column, or 3x3 block.
So everything's connected.
Exactly. It's like a puzzle where knowing one piece gives you information about a bunch of others.
So it's perfect for exploring these descriptions.
Right, because different descriptions can reveal different things about how the information is structured.
Can you give us an example of how they did that?
Absolutely. Remember total correlation and O information?
Of course.
Well, they use machine learning to find descriptions that either maximized or minimized those measures for Sudoku boards.
So they were looking for descriptions that either emphasized the interconnectedness or showed whether the information was mostly redundant or synergistic.
Exactly. And they found some really interesting things.
Like what?
For example, the descriptions that maximized O information.
The ones that highlighted redundancy.
Right. They were pretty intuitive. They basically involved communicating the same partial information about every cell.
So like saying for each cell, we'll tell you if the number is even or odd.
Exactly. Or we'll tell you which third of the possible numbers the cell's value falls into.
And as they increased the amount of information in this redundant way,
yeah,
they went from being able to distinguish one number from the other 8 to eventually revealing the full state of each cell.
It's a gradually zooming in on the board, revealing more detail.
But always in a way that emphasizes the redundancy.
Exactly. Which makes sense.
Right, because Sudoku boards are so constrained.
Yeah, there's a lot of redundancy built in.
Knowing one cell eliminates possibilities for tons of others.
Exactly. So these high O information descriptions are basically capturing that redundancy.
Highlighting how connected everything is.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
When they looked at descriptions that minimized O information.
Meaning maximize synergy.
Right. The patterns were much less intuitive.
So these are the descriptions that focus on how information from different parts of the board combines to create something bigger.
Yeah, something greater than just the individual pieces.
And what do they find?
Well, the patterns were much more complex, reflecting those subtle dependencies that make Sudoku so challenging.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. One of the most synergistic descriptions involved communicating one bit of information in 3 different ways.
Okay.
Spread out across a row and a 2x2 block.
So it's like saying this cell is either a 1 or a 2, and this other cell in the same row is also either a 1 or a 2.
Yeah.
And this third cell in the same 2x2 block is also either a 1 or a 2.
Exactly. And this description is highly synergistic because knowing any two of those pieces completely determines the third.
It's like the information is encoded in this distributed way.
Right. You need multiple pieces to see the whole picture.
And this highlights how powerful this framework is.
Totally. It lets us uncover these hidden patterns of synergy that you wouldn't see just by looking at individual cells or groups.
Like finding a secret code.
That unlocks the deeper structure.
This makes me wonder how this applies to something as complex as language.
That's what they looked at in their third case study.
Oh yeah, the English text.
They applied this same framework to sequences of letters, focusing on 4grams.
Can you remind me what those are?
A 4gram is just a sequence of 4 letters.
Okay.
It could be a word like that, or it could be from a longer word, like annexation from information.
Got it. So how did they use descriptions with these 4grams?
They compared 4grams that formed complete words to those extracted from within 8-letter words.
Okay.
Using O information as their measure of complexity.
So they were trying to see if the 4-letter chunks carried more redundant or synergistic information depending on whether they were standalone words or parts of bigger words?
Exactly.
What did they find?
The 4grams from 8-letter words tended to have much lower O information.
Meaning they were more synergistic.
Right. The letters in those longer words are working together in a more complex way than in simple 4-letter words.
Like the constraints of English grammar and spelling create a system where the meaning of a word comes from the interplay of the letters, not just the individual letters themselves.
Precisely. You can't just scramble the letters in a long word and expect it to still make sense.
Exactly. The order matters.
And they went even further.
Oh, how so?
They used machine learning to find descriptions that maximized or minimized O information, but not just for the whole 4gram.
For parts of it?
Yeah, for different combinations of letters within the 4gram.
So like the first and third letters or the second and fourth?
Exactly. And they found some really interesting groupings.
What kind of grouping?
For example, in descriptions that maximize synergy, they found clusters of letters that often appeared together in certain positions within words.
Like consonants at the beginning or vowels in the middle?
Exactly. It's like the machine learning is rediscovering the building blocks of English phonology.
The patterns of sounds.
Right. It's amazing we're using information theory and machine learning to reverse engineer the structure of language.
This is blowing my mind. But I think we need to take a break and let our listener process all of this.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's pick up where we left off next time.
Wow, I'm still thinking about all that stuff about descriptions and how they can uncover hidden patterns in everything from magnets to Sudoku to language.
It really is pretty amazing how this framework can be applied to so many different things.
You know, one thing that really stuck with me was how the machine learning was able to find those subtle patterns of synergy in language.
Yeah, it's like it was rediscovering the rules of grammar and phonology all on its own.
Exactly. So does that mean we could use this to explore how languages evolved over time?
Oh, absolutely.
How different languages are related to each other?
Yeah.
Maybe even how language emerged in the first place?
It's definitely possible.
That's incredible.
It would be like a new Rosetta Stone.
But instead of translating words, it's translating the very structure of language.
The essence of how they convey meaning.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to language, right? We could use this for any complex system where information is key.
Oh, absolutely. Think about social networks. Yeah.
Economic systems.
Even the human brain.
Especially the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine analyzing brain activity not just by looking at individual neurons,
but by understanding how information flows across entire networks.
Exactly. Instead of just seeing a bunch of flashing lights,
Right.
we could start to understand how thoughts and emotions are encoded in those patterns.
And this could have huge implications for things like diagnosing and treating neurological disorders.
Absolutely. Imagine being able to identify subtle disruptions in the brain.
That might signal the early stages of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Exactly. It would be like having a whole new set of diagnostic tools.
And the potential applications go way beyond medicine, right?
For sure. Think about analyzing the spread of misinformation on social media.
We could see how fake news spreads and figure out how to counter it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or we could analyze financial markets, understand how bubbles and crashes happen.
Maybe even make economic systems more stable.
The possibilities really are endless. Yeah. And this research is just the beginning.
It feels like we're on the verge of something huge, with machine learning getting better and better.
Our ability to explore these descriptions is just going to keep growing.
We'll be able to dive even deeper into these complex systems,
Uncover even more hidden patterns,
and gain even more insights into how the world works.
This deep dive has been mind-blowing.
I agree.
So what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
First, I hope they appreciate the power of descriptions for understanding complex systems.
It's not just about lifting parts.
Right.
It's about understanding how information is structured and processed within those systems.
Exactly. And second, machine learning is becoming an essential tool for exploring these descriptions.
It helps us find those hidden patterns we might miss otherwise.
And lastly, and maybe most importantly, this research has implications far beyond the specific examples we talked about.
So it's not just about magnets and Sudoku and English text.
Exactly. It provides a framework for analyzing complexity in any field.
From physics to biology
to economics to human behavior.
It's a whole new way of thinking.
About the world.
Embracing the interconnectedness of everything.
And recognizing that information is the key to unlocking those secrets.
So well said. I hope everyone listening will think about how this framework applies to their own interests.
What complex systems do they see in their own lives?
What hidden patterns might they discover?
The exploration doesn't stop here. Keep asking those questions, keep diving deep, and keep that curiosity burning bright.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.
And until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world of complex systems.
See you next time. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring complex systems through the really fascinating lens of information theory, all about revealing those hidden structures in data that often go unnoticed.
Yeah.
And we've got some fascinating research from the University of Pennsylvania that uses this new concept called descriptions to really break down these systems.
Right.
And instead of looking at all the information of each component, we're focusing on specific, strategically chosen pieces of information, right?
That's right. What's really intriguing about this approach is that it moves beyond just measuring the raw data.
Okay.
And it delves into how the information is actually structured and shared within a system.
Interesting.
It's like we're developing a new language to describe complexity.
I like that. And to add to the excitement, we'll be seeing how machine learning is actually used to find the most insightful descriptions, the ones that truly kind of unlock the secrets of these systems.
Yep.
And we'll be diving into 3 very different examples: a simple system of interacting spins, Sudoku puzzles, and the statistics of how letters are arranged in English words.
It's fascinating how this method can be applied to such diverse systems. You know, I'm particularly interested in seeing if there are any common threads that connect them, any underlying principles that govern the flow of information across, different domains.
Right. Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's lay the groundwork with some information theory basics. So first up, we've got entropy, a measure of uncertainty or surprise. How would you explain this to someone who's not familiar with the concept?
Okay, well, imagine you're trying to predict the outcome of a coin toss.
Okay.
If the coin is fair, there's a 50-50 chance of getting heads or tails.
Right.
So the entropy is high. There's a lot of uncertainty. But if the coin is weighted to always land on heads, the entropy is low. There's no surprise at all.
So entropy essentially tells us how much information we gain by observing the outcome of an event.
Exactly. And in the context of complex systems, entropy helps us quantify the uncertainty associated with the state of the system.
Okay.
Now let's move on to mutual information, which measures how much knowing one thing tells us about another.
Right.
For instance, knowing the season can give you a good idea of the average temperature.
Okay.
That's high mutual information.
So mutual information is all about capturing those dependencies between different parts of a system.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now, how do these concepts tie into descriptions? Well, descriptions allow us to focus on specific aspects of each component within a system.
Okay.
It's like highlighting the key phrases in a long document to capture the gist of the content.
Okay, so descriptions are a way of strategically compressing information, focusing on the most relevant bits.
Exactly. And to analyze these descriptions, we use 2 key information-theoretic quantities: total correlation and O information. Total correlation tells us how much the components of a system are interlinked. Think of a flock of birds flying in perfect synchronization. That's high total correlation.
So it's a measure of how much the parts are moving together as a whole.
Right.
What about O information? How is that different?
O information tells us whether the components are mainly working together, which we call redundancy, or holding unique, surprising information, which we call synergy. Think of a symphony orchestra. Are all the instruments playing the same melody, redundancy, or are they harmonizing with distinct parts, synergy?
I like that analogy. It's like O information helps us distinguish between predictable patterns and those unexpected emergent properties that make a system more than just the sum of its parts.
Right.
Now let's dive into the first case study, a system of interacting spins. Can you set the scene for us?
Okay, so imagine 5 tiny magnets arranged in a network.
Okay.
Some attracting each other, which we call ferromagnetic, and some repelling each other, which we call antiferromagnetic.
Got it.
Each spin can point up or down, and the interactions between them determine the overall energy of the system.
Okay.
The researchers wanted to use descriptions to map out the connections between these spins and see how information flows through the network.
So how did they actually apply descriptions in this case? What did those descriptions represent?
They represented different ways of compressing information about the spin states as descriptions.
Okay.
And this allowed them to explore different levels of detail about the system, from very coarse-grained summaries to more fine-grained representations.
So by tweaking these descriptions, they could essentially zoom in and out on different aspects of the system.
Exactly. Now, one of the things they looked at was how total correlation changed depending on the description they chose.
So what happened when they maximized total correlation? What do those descriptions reveal?
The descriptions that maximized total correlation pinpointed the spins that were most strongly connected. In their 5-spin system, the description with the highest total correlation linked the 3 spins that were ferromagnetically coupled in a chain.
Interesting.
It makes intuitive sense because those spins tend to align together.
Yeah.
So knowing the state of one tells you a lot about the states of the others.
So maximizing total correlation helped them identify those clusters of spins that act in a coordinated manner.
That's right.
What about minimizing total correlation? Did that reveal anything interesting?
Minimizing total correlation was like isolating the outliers.
Okay.
The spins that behave more independently.
So the ones that didn't really care what the other ones were doing.
Right. These were the spins that were weakly connected to the rest of the network, meaning their states were less predictable based on the states of their neighbors.
Got it. So total correlation gave them a sense of the overall connectedness of the system, highlighting both the strong links and the weak links. What insights did O information provide in this case?
O information helped them distinguish between redundancy and synergy in the system.
Okay.
Descriptions with high O information, indicating high redundancy, highlighted groups of spins, where knowing the state of one gave you a good prediction of the states of the others.
Okay.
This was often the case for spins that were strongly coupled, like those in the ferromagnetic chain we mentioned earlier.
Like those spins are echoing each other, carrying a lot of redundant information.
Yeah.
What about descriptions with low O information? Those with high synergy? What did those reveal?
Low O information pointed to groups of spins that exhibited emergent behavior, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. These were the configurations where the interactions between spins created unexpected patterns that couldn't be predicted just by looking at the individual components.
So O information helped them uncover those hidden relationships that emerge from the complex interplay between the spins.
Right.
This is incredibly fascinating. We're starting to see how powerful this framework can be for dissecting complex systems.
It's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm excited to see how these concepts play out in the other case studies.
Me too. Shall we move on to Sudoku?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's crack that code.
Welcome back to our deep dive into complex systems. You know, I'm really enjoying this exploration of how information theory can kind of shed light on hidden structures.
Yeah, me too. It's amazing how these concepts can be applied to such diverse systems. Last time, we saw how total correlation and O information helped reveal patterns of connectivity and emergence in a simple system of interacting spins.
Right. And now we're going to tackle a classic puzzle, Sudoku. I'm curious to see how descriptions can help us understand the logic and strategy of this game.
It's a perfect example of a system with a really hidden structure.
Right.
You can't just randomly place numbers on a Sudoku board.
Right.
There are these rules and constraints that dictate the solution.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so intriguing for this kind of analysis. The researchers applied the same framework of descriptions to Sudoku boards, aiming to capture the information flow within the puzzle.
So do they also focus on maximizing and minimizing total correlation and O information in this case?
They focus primarily on O information, looking for descriptions that were either maximally redundant or maximally synergistic. And what they found with the maximally redundant descriptions was really interesting.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more. What did these redundant descriptions reveal?
Well, they actually aligned with common Sudoku solving strategies.
Oh, wow. Okay.
These descriptions highlighted the most obvious constraints and patterns that human players use. Things like checking rows, columns, and boxes to eliminate possibilities.
So it's like the machine learning was rediscovering the basic logic of Sudoku. That's pretty cool.
It is. But the truly surprising results came from looking at the descriptions with minimal O information.
Okay.
The maximally synergistic ones.
Those were the ones that captured those less obvious patterns, right? The ones that even experienced Sudoku players might miss.
Exactly. These descriptions revealed subtle relationships between squares that emerge from the complex interplay of constraints.
Okay.
It wasn't just about looking at individual rows, columns, or boxes. The synergistic descriptions highlighted patterns that involved combinations of those elements.
So the machine learning was finding hidden strategies.
Yeah.
Connections that weren't immediately apparent to the human eye.
Yes.
I'm starting to see how powerful this approach could be for understanding complex systems. But how did they actually represent these descriptions? Was it just a bunch of numbers and formulas?
They actually went a step further and visualized the descriptions, which helped bring the analysis to life.
How did they do that?
Well, they did this by converting the soft compression schemes into hard clusterings of values.
So instead of just seeing a jumble of numbers, they created a visual representation of how the description grouped the possible digits in each square.
Yes.
That's clever. What kind of insights did these visualizations provide?
It allowed them to see which digits were treated as equivalent by the description.
Okay.
For example, in a maximally redundant description, all the digits that couldn't possibly be in a given square, based on the basic rules of Sudoku, they would be grouped together. It's like the machine was saying, these digits are all equally impossible in this spot.
I see. So it's not just about identifying the correct digit for each square. It's also about understanding the relationships between the possibilities.
Right.
And how those relationships shape the information flow within the puzzle.
Precisely. The visualizations offered a way to see how the machine was thinking as it navigated the constraints of the puzzle. It's like getting a glimpse into the mind of a master Sudoku solver.
This is absolutely fascinating. I'm starting to see Sudoku in a whole new light. But I'm also eager to dive into the final case study, language. Can we switch gears and explore that now?
Absolutely. Let's move on to the fascinating world of words and letters.
Okay. I'm ready to explore this final frontier, language. It always amazes me how much hidden structure and order there is within something that feels so fluid and creative.
Yeah, language is a wonderfully complex system, and applying this framework of descriptions to it reveals some fascinating insights. Remember how we talked about redundancy and synergy?
Right.
Those concepts play a key role here.
Right. Redundancy being those predictable patterns and synergy representing the unexpected or emergent properties.
Right.
I'm curious to see how those apply to the way we use words and letters.
Well, the researchers focused on analyzing the statistics of 4 grams, sequences of 4 letters.
Okay.
And they specifically wanted to compare 4 grams that form complete words to those taken from within longer words.
Okay, so they're looking at those building blocks of language and how they're organized differently depending on whether they're standalone words or parts of bigger words. What did they find?
They discovered a striking difference in the space of descriptions for those 2 cases. When they analyzed 4 grams that formed complete words, the descriptions tended to have higher O information, indicating more redundancy.
That makes sense to me. Words are more predictable than random strings of letters. We have a mental lexicon and grammatical rules that guide our expectations.
Right.
Think about how easily we can fill in the blanks in a word like CT.
Exactly. And that predictability is reflected in the higher O information of those descriptions.
Okay.
It's like the machine learning is capturing the inherent structure of our language. However, when they analyzed 4 grams within longer words, they found something different.
I'm intrigued. What did those descriptions reveal?
Those descriptions showed lower O information, indicating more synergy. It suggests that the arrangement of letters within longer words is less constrained by those rules of word formation. There's more room for unexpected combinations and subtle variations.
So it's like those 4 grams are carrying more unique, unpredictable information.
That's right.
It's not just about following a set pattern. It's about conveying a specific meaning within the context of a larger word.
Precisely. It highlights the nuanced interplay between predictability and surprise that shapes the structure of language.
Yeah.
We have those building blocks of words, but how they're combined and arranged creates a whole new layer of complexity and meaning.
This has been an incredible journey. We started with the fundamental concepts of information theory and ended up exploring the hidden structures of language, games, and even magnetism. You know, I'm really starting to appreciate the power of descriptions as a tool for understanding complex systems.
Yeah, it's a testament to the beauty and elegance of information theory. You know, these concepts have applications far beyond what we've discussed today. Imagine using descriptions to understand the dynamics of social networks, the fluctuations of financial markets, or even the intricate workings of the human brain.
Oh, wow. The possibilities are truly mind-boggling. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of what we can learn about complex systems.
And that's the beauty of science. There's always more to discover.
Yeah.
You know, this deep dive has hopefully sparked some curiosity and inspiration.
It really has.
Keep exploring those complex systems that pique your interest.
I know I will.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those minds curious. Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to get into something pretty mind-bending.
Mind-bending is right, but also super fascinating.
Definitely. We're going to try to unpack this paper, Surveying the Space of Descriptions of a Composite System with Machine Learning.
Catchy title, right.
Well, it's definitely dense, but from what I've been able to gather, it's exploring a new way to understand, well...
complex systems.
Exactly. By looking at the relationships between all the different parts.
Which is basically like everything, right?
Pretty much. I mean, think about it. Your brain, the internet, the ecosystem, even a simple Sudoku puzzle. They're all complex systems.
Right, systems made up of tons of interacting components. And this paper is using information theory to try to make sense of all that interaction.
Okay, so information theory, isn't that usually about like compressing data and stuff?
It is, but it's actually a much broader framework for understanding how information flows and is structured within systems.
So how does that apply to complex systems?
Well, imagine a system as a network of components that are constantly exchanging information.
Okay, I can picture that.
Information theory provides tools to measure that information flow, to see how much information is shared between different parts of the system.
So it's like quantifying how much those parts are talking to each other.
Exactly. And by analyzing that conversation, we can start to understand how the parts influence each other and contribute to the overall behavior of the system.
That makes sense. But this paper actually argues that a lot of traditional information theory analyses are, well, a bit limited.
Limited how?
They tend to look at whole subsystems at once, rather than the individual components and their interactions.
They call it coarse graining, right? Like trying to understand a city by only looking at a map of its different neighborhoods.
Yeah, exactly. You miss all the street-level details, the individual buildings, and the people moving between them.
All the messy, real-life stuff that actually makes the city what it is.
And that's where this paper's idea of descriptions comes in, right?
Right. Descriptions are basically like different ways of focusing on the information associated with each component of the system.
Okay, that sounds pretty abstract. Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to understand a piece of music. You could focus on the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, or the instrumentation.
Oh, I see. So each of those would be a different description of the music.
Exactly. And by analyzing each description, you get a different perspective on how the music works as a whole.
That's a really cool way to think about it.
And the really neat thing is that the researchers in this paper actually use machine learning to find these descriptions.
Machine learning, as in like AI.
Yep. They train neural networks to sift through a vast space of possible descriptions and identify the ones that highlight the most interesting features of the system.
So they're using AI to find the best ways to look at a complex system.
You got it. And they do this by focusing on a couple of key information-theoretic quantities. One is called total correlation, which measures how much the parts of a system are interconnected.
Okay, so like how much they're influencing each other.
Exactly. And the other is called O information, which tells us whether a system is more redundant or synergistic.
Redundant versus synergistic. Remind me what those mean again.
So redundancy basically means that information is repeated across different parts of the system.
Like if you have a choir where everyone is singing the same melody, that would be highly redundant.
Perfect example. And synergy means that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that there's something new and unexpected that emerges from the interaction of all the components.
So something like a jazz band, where each instrument is doing its own thing, but together they create something totally unique.
Exactly. And by using machine learning to find descriptions that maximize or minimize these quantities, they can reveal all sorts of hidden patterns and relationships within a system.
That's incredible. So they've tested this approach on a few different systems, right?
Yep, 3 to be exact. They looked at a simple spin system, like a bunch of magnets interacting with each other.
Oh, that's cool.
Then they tackled Sudoku puzzles.
Those always make my head spin.
And finally, they analyzed sequences of letters from natural language.
Wow. So they're really putting this approach through its paces.
They are. And the results are pretty fascinating. So which system do you want to dive into first? Let's tackle those Sudoku puzzles. Ready to unravel some mysteries.
I'm game. Sudoku has always kind of baffled me, to be honest. Like, the rules are so simple, but
they create this crazy, complex system.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. You have a grid, 9 by 9, and each cell can only hold one of 9 numbers.
And then you add those rules. No repeats in any row, any column, or any of those 3 by 3 blocks.
Right. And suddenly you have this web of interconnected dependencies. Like filling in one number can have a ripple effect across the whole puzzle.
It's like a chain reaction, and that's what makes it so interesting from an information theory perspective.
Because each cell holds a certain amount of information.
Exactly. And those Sudoku rules, they basically dictate how that information is shared and constrained across the whole grid.
So it's like a network of clues, and revealing one clue can unlock a bunch of others.
Perfect analogy. And that's where these descriptions come in again. Remember how we talked about them with the spin system?
Yeah, they're like different ways of looking at the information associated with each component.
Right. So in the context of Sudoku, the researchers used descriptions to explore how information is distributed and shared across those little squares on the board.
Makes sense. And they're still focusing on O information, right, to see how much redundancy versus synergy there is.
Exactly. So a highly redundant description would focus on cells that are kind of isolated, where the information doesn't tell you much about the rest of the puzzle.
So like focusing on a single row or column in isolation?
Yeah, that's a good example. You might have all different numbers, but they don't really give you any clues about the overall solution.
Right. But a synergistic description, on the other hand, would capture more of those interconnected relationships between the cells.
Precisely. It would highlight the patterns that emerge from the interplay of all those Sudoku rules.
So patterns that wouldn't be obvious if you were just looking at individual cells or rows in isolation.
Right. And that's exactly what they found. They trained their neural networks to find descriptions that maximize O information for Sudoku.
And what did those descriptions show?
Well, the cool thing is they kind of mapped out a logical way to solve the puzzle.
As in the algorithm learned how to play Sudoku.
In a way, yeah. It started by distinguishing one number from the other 3 in each square, and then gradually revealing more information as it went along.
Wow, so it was like showing us its thought process as it figured out the solution.
Exactly. But it gets even more interesting when they looked at the descriptions that minimized O information.
The ones that emphasize O information.
The ones that emphasize synergy, right? Where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. And those descriptions were wild. They revealed all these unexpected patterns of interactions between squares.
Wait, really? Like patterns that even a Sudoku master wouldn't see. Yeah, they weren't obvious at all just by looking at the puzzle. But through the lens of these synergistic descriptions, these hidden connections just popped out.
So even in something as seemingly straightforward as Sudoku, there were these hidden layers of complexity.
Absolutely. And it highlights how this approach, using descriptions in information theory, can reveal stuff that we might never notice otherwise.
It's like there's this whole secret language of Sudoku that we're just starting to decode.
I like that. And the coolest thing is, they were able to actually visualize these patterns.
Wait, there are pictures of this?
Oh, yeah. The paper has some awesome diagrams that show how these clusters of interconnected cells emerge.
I have to see this. So the Sudoku grid basically transforms into this like abstract art piece.
Pretty much. It's like looking at Sudoku through a kaleidoscope.
Mind-blowing. It makes you wonder, if we're missing this much complexity in a Sudoku puzzle, what else are we not seeing in the world around us?
That's the question, isn't it? And that leads us perfectly to our final case study, language. If a simple number puzzle can have these hidden depths, imagine what we might find when we apply this approach to something as rich and intricate as human language.
All right, language. It's how we think, how we communicate, how we make sense of the world.
It's a pretty amazing system when you think about it.
Definitely. And this paper takes a look at it through the lens of, you guessed it, 4 grams.
Those little sequences of 4 letters, they might seem basic, but
they can actually tell us a lot about the underlying structure of language.
Exactly. Think about how some letter combinations are way more common than others.
Like C or ing.
Right. And the order of those letters matters, too. You can't just scramble them up and expect them to make sense.
So there are patterns embedded in language, just like in those Sudoku puzzles.
And those patterns reflect the rules and constraints of the language itself.
So we're basically treating each letter in a 4-gram as a component of the system.
Right. And then we can use those descriptions, along with total correlation and O information, to see what kinds of patterns emerge.
Okay, so let's start with total correlation. If we maximize it for 4 grams, what does that tell us about language?
It highlights the most interconnected letters, the ones that tend to appear together a lot.
So it's like identifying the common building blocks of language, the letter combinations that form the backbone of words.
Exactly. They're like the common chord progressions in music. They create a sense of familiarity and structure.
And what about minimizing total correlation? What kind of insights would we get there?
Well, that would bring out the more unique and unexpected letter combinations, the ones that are more specific to certain words or contexts.
So it's like focusing on the more specialized vocabulary, the words that add nuance and flavor to our communication.
Exactly. Like those spicy, unexpected chord changes that make a song really stand out.
This is so fascinating. It's like we're getting a glimpse into the hidden architecture of language.
And don't forget about O information. Remember how it tells us whether a system is more redundant or synergistic.
Right. So a highly redundant description of 4 grams would focus on those common letter combinations, while a synergistic description would highlight more of those unique patterns.
You got it. And here's where it gets really interesting. They found a big difference in O information, depending on whether they looked at 4-letter words or 4 grams taken from longer 8-letter words.
Wait, really? What was the difference?
The 4 grams from the longer words tended to be much more synergistic.
Meaning that the information content of those 4 grams really depends on the specific combination of letters.
Precisely. You can't just swap out one letter and expect it to still make sense in the context of the whole word.
But for the 4-letter words, the descriptions were more redundant,
suggesting that the letters in those shorter words are a bit more interchangeable.
So it's like, with shorter words, each individual letter carries less weight in terms of the overall meaning.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And it kind of makes sense, right? Shorter words tend to be more common, more basic building blocks of language.
Whereas longer words are usually more specialized. So each letter plays a more crucial role in conveying the meaning.
Exactly. And keep in mind, they're using machine learning to analyze all of this. For a single letter with 26 possible values, the number of potential descriptions is just astronomical.
It's mind-boggling to think about.
It really is. But it's thanks to these powerful algorithms that we can even begin to explore this level of complexity in language.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it's the realization that even the things we take for granted, like language or a Sudoku puzzle, are actually incredibly complex systems.
And with the right tools, like this approach using descriptions in information theory, we can start to unpack that complexity and see the world in a whole new light.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly surrounded by these hidden patterns and connections just waiting to be discovered.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain is officially fried. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of complex systems. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those synapses firing. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on this paper about using machine learning to understand how complex systems are organized.
Oh, wow, yeah. It really uses some pretty heavy information theory.
Yeah, it's going to be a workout for our brains, for sure.
Mm.
But I think it'll be worth it. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely. I think the most interesting thing about this paper is that it breaks down complex systems into their individual parts instead of trying to analyze them as these huge, unmanageable things.
All right. So instead of looking at the whole forest, we're examining each tree. But then they go a step further, don't they? This paper isn't just about measuring the information in each part. It's about figuring out how to allocate that information in different ways.
Exactly. They use the term descriptions for these different allocations, like creating different kinds of maps of the same area.
Oh, I like that. So depending on how you arrange the information, you can highlight different aspects of the system's structure.
Exactly. You can emphasize certain features or relationships depending on what kind of description you choose.
So it's not just about measuring information. It's about finding the most informative way to represent that information. It's like data compression, but for complex systems.
I like that analogy. And the really cool thing is that they use machine learning to find the best descriptions, the ones that maximize or minimize things like total correlation or O information.
Okay, hold on for a second. For those of us who need a little refresher, can you remind us what exactly total correlation and O information are, and why are they so important?
Sure. So total correlation basically measures how interconnected the different parts of a system are, like how much information is shared between them.
So a system with high total correlation would be like a close-knit family where everyone knows each other's business.
That's a perfect example. And a system with low total correlation would be more like a bunch of random people on the street. They might be in the same place, but they aren't really connected.
Got it. And what about O information? What does that tell us?
Well, O information is a bit more complex. It tells us whether the different parts of a system are working together or independently. And if they are working together, it can tell us whether they are redundant, meaning they're carrying the same information, or synergistic, meaning they're creating something new together.
Okay, that makes sense. So the paper uses machine learning to find the best descriptions for maximizing or minimizing these information quantities. But how do they actually apply this to real systems?
Well, they start with a pretty simple example, a system of interacting spins, kind of like tiny magnets. This is a classic problem in physics, but they use this new information theory framework to uncover some really interesting insights about how the spins are connected.
So we're not just talking about whether the spins are aligned or not. We're talking about how much information is contained in the way they interact and how that information is spread throughout the system.
Exactly. And by finding these optimal descriptions, they can highlight different aspects of how the system is organized. For example, they can figure out which spins are the most strongly correlated or which ones are contributing to that synergistic information we talked about earlier.
Okay, and they actually walk us through the math for the probability distribution of states in this spin system. You're the equation lover. Want to take this one?
Oh, I'd love to. So the equation for the probability distribution has this term in it. XP, HP, HXX is the energy of the system. And it takes into account all of the interactions between the spins, which are determined by what we call coupling constants.
Right, and those coupling constants tell us how strong the interactions are between the spins. Some spins want to align in the same direction, and some want to be opposite, right? Like that's ferromagnetic and antiferromagnetic coupling, if I remember correctly.
Yes. You're exactly right. And the equation tells us that states with lower energy are more likely to occur, while states with higher energy are less likely. It's like the system is trying to settle into its lowest energy state.
Okay, so this equation is basically telling us how likely we are to find the spins in a particular arrangement. But where does the information theory part come in?
Well, instead of just looking at those raw probabilities, we're interested in how much information is contained in them. Remember, the whole point of this paper is to find those descriptions that show us the most interesting patterns of information in the system.
So we're not just interested in what the spins are doing, we're interested in what they're telling us about the whole system. It's like they're gossiping, and we're trying to listen in.
I love that. And by finding those optimal descriptions, we can sort of tune into the most informative channels of gossip.
This is so much more nuanced than just calculating like a simple correlation between the spins. It's like we're looking at the system in a whole new way.
I completely agree. And the best part is that this approach isn't limited to spin systems. We can use it for all sorts of complex systems, like, for example, the Sudoku boards they talk about next.
Sudoku. Now, that's something I can get behind. They seem so simple, but those little squares have a whole world of rules and connections between them. I'm curious to see how they apply this information theory stuff to something like a Sudoku puzzle.
Me too. It really shows how even something that seems straightforward can have hidden depths when we look at it from this perspective.
All right, let's dive into the world of Sudoku. So they use O information to analyze these boards, right? Which means that, in this case, a high O information value would tell us that knowing the value of one square gives us a lot of information about the values of other squares.
Exactly. And in the paper, they specifically look at a 4x4 Sudoku board and find that the O information starts to become positive, meaning we start seeing redundancy once we know the values of more than 6 squares.
Right, because the more squares you know, the more you can deduce about the remaining squares. But what about those descriptions? What do they look like when we're talking about Sudoku?
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting visually. The paper actually shows us what these descriptions look like, and they involve clustering different numbers together in each square. So like in a 4x4 Sudoku board, you might have a description where the numbers 1 and 2 are grouped together in one square.
Hold on. So we're not saying that 1 and 2 are the same in that square, right? We're just like compressing the information by treating them as a single unit in this description.
Exactly. It's kind of like creating a simplified map. Instead of labeling every single building, you group similar buildings together under a broader category.
I see. Okay, so by finding these optimal clusters of numbers, these optimal descriptions, they can reveal these hidden patterns of redundancy and synergy between the squares of a Sudoku board. And they can do this way faster than just trying every possible combination.
Precisely. Imagine trying to analyze every single possible combination of numbers on a Sudoku board. It would take forever. But by using machine learning, they can zero in on those most informative descriptions much more efficiently.
This is amazing. Who knew there was so much to discover in a simple Sudoku puzzle? Okay, so we've tackled spin systems and Sudoku boards. What other complex systems did they look at?
Well, they actually go on to analyze language. They look at 4grams in English text, which are just sequences of 4 letters, to see if this approach can tell us anything interesting about the structure of language.
Whoa, that's a whole different ballgame. Language is so intricate and full of subtle patterns. I can't wait to hear what they found.
It's a really cool application of this framework. They use O information again, but this time they're comparing 4grams that form actual words to 4grams that are just random sequences of letters.
I have a feeling those two types of 4grams are going to have very different O information values.
You're right. They found that the 4grams that form words tend to have higher O information values, meaning they're more redundant. Which makes sense, right? Letters and words aren't just thrown together randomly. There are rules and conventions that govern how they're arranged.
So knowing one letter in a word often gives you clues about what the other letters might be, which is reflected in that higher O information value. It's like those letters are whispering secrets to each other.
Exactly. The constraints of language create those patterns of redundancy. And on the other hand, random sequences of letters have lower O information, suggesting less redundancy and potentially more synergy, meaning that the information only emerges when you consider multiple letters together.
So this analysis is giving us a glimpse into the underlying structure of language, the way letters connect and interact to create meaning. It's like we're peeling back the layers to see the machinery of language at work.
And they don't stop there. The paper also introduces something called hardened compression schemes for the 4grams.
Hardened compression schemes. That sounds intense. What are those all about?
Think of them as even more specialized descriptions. They show how letters are grouped together based on how distinguishable they are. It's like taking those clusters we saw in the Sudoku example and making them even more distinct.
So like, for example, they might group all the vowels together or all the consonants because they share certain characteristics. It's like making those simplified maps again. But this time we're grouping buildings based on their architectural style or their function.
Exactly. And by analyzing these hardened compression schemes, they uncover some really interesting insights into how information is encoded in language. For instance, they find that some groups of letters are way more distinguishable from others, suggesting they carry more information.
This is incredible. It's amazing to think about how much information is packed into even the simplest units of language, like just 4 letters in this case.
It really highlights the power of this information theory approach. And what's even more remarkable is that these techniques can be applied to a huge variety of complex systems beyond what we've discussed so far. We're talking neuroscience, social networks, economics, you name it.
It's like we've discovered a new language for understanding the world around us, a language of information and connections.
I love that. And the best part is that this approach is constantly evolving as machine learning techniques become more sophisticated, We're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Wow, this is really exciting. So much to think about and discuss. We're going to need a break to process all of this. We'll be back in a minute to keep exploring this mind-blowing research. All right, we're back. And man, there's so much to unpack in this paper. It's like we've gone on a mental sprint through information theory.
I know, right? It's definitely a lot to take in, but it's so fascinating. One thing that really struck me is how this approach could even help us understand how humans perceive complexity.
Oh yeah, it all boils down to our limited processing power, right? Like our brains can't handle the full blast of information coming at us all the time.
Exactly. We have to simplify, prioritize, create shortcuts, all that.
It's like we're all running our own internal hardened compression schemes, filtering out the noise and focusing on what's important.
I love that analogy. And, the paper actually suggests that the number of possible descriptions for a system might be connected to how complex we perceive that system to be.
Oh, interesting. So a system with just a few really informative descriptions would feel less complex to us than a system with a ton of possible descriptions.
Exactly. Like think of a small town with just a few landmarks versus a sprawling city with endless possibilities.
Right, right. It's like our brains are constantly searching for the best descriptions, the ones that help us make sense of the world without getting completely overwhelmed.
That's a great way to put it. And the paper doesn't just stop at total correlation and O information. They actually touch on a couple other information-theoretic quantities that can be used to describe complex systems.
Oh, like what? Always happy to expand my information theory vocabulary.
Well, there's this thing called binding information. Sometimes it's also called enigmatic information. It represents the information that you can only get when you look at the whole system together, the information that gets lost if you try to analyze the parts separately.
So it's the secret sauce of the system, the thing that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. It's the information that can't be reduced to any single component.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
And what was that other measure you mentioned? S information, was it?
Yes. S information is a way of measuring synergy, but it specifically focuses on how much information you gain about one part of a system when you know the state of the other parts.
So it's all about the connections, the relationships between the different components. It tells us how much knowing about one part helps us predict or understand another part.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that this whole framework of finding optimal descriptions could be used to analyze all these different information-theoretic quantities, not just total correlation and O information.
So it's like we have this incredibly versatile toolkit for dissecting complex systems, revealing their inner workings from all these different angles.
That's what makes this research so exciting. It gives us a powerful new way to understand the complex systems that shape our lives, everything from the brain to the stock market to the entire ecosystem.
Okay, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty here. The paper also talks about the technical aspects of how they actually implement this machine learning approach for finding those optimal descriptions. And since I'm a bit of a math nerd, I'm curious to hear about some of the key concepts involved.
All right, let's dive in. One of the core ideas is that they represent these descriptions as a collection of communication channels, which is a really clever way to frame the problem in terms of information theory.
Communication channels. So it's like each part of the system has its own little information pipeline, and we're trying to figure out how much information is flowing through those pipelines.
That's a great way to visualize it. And the goal is to optimize those channels, to either maximize or minimize the particular information theoretic quantity we're interested in, whether that's total correlation, O information, or one of the other measures we talked about.
So it's like we're fine-tuning those information pipelines to get the clearest signal, the signal that tells us the most about how the system is organized.
Exactly. And to do this optimization, they use a bunch of different techniques, including something called noise contrastive estimation, or NCE for short.
NCE. That's a powerful technique for estimating mutual information, which basically tells us how much information two variables share.
You got it. And in this case, we're using NCE to estimate the mutual information between the parts of the system and their corresponding descriptions.
So we're basically measuring how much information is being transmitted through those communication channels we talked about.
Right. And by adjusting the parameters of those channels, you can think of it like changing the bandwidth or signal strength, we can find the descriptions that either maximize or minimize that mutual information.
Okay, it's all starting to come together.
Yeah.
And I think they also mentioned something called a distributed information bottleneck approach. What is that all about?
It's another technique that's often used in machine learning. It basically involves compressing the information about a variable while still keeping the most important information for predicting another variable.
So it's like squeezing the information through a bottleneck, forcing it to become more concise and focused.
I love that analogy. And in this case, the important variable is the overall state of the system. And we're trying to find descriptions of the parts that give us the most information about that overall state.
So instead of trying to describe every little detail of each part, we're creating these summaries that highlight the information that's most essential for understanding the big picture.
Precisely. And the paper shows that this distributed information bottleneck approach is actually closely related to this idea of finding optimal descriptions.
It's like we're using multiple tools to look at the same problem. And they're all giving us slightly different perspectives, but they're all ultimately helping us understand how these complex systems work.
That's a great point. And by combining all these different techniques, the paper creates a really robust and flexible framework for analyzing complex systems.
This is seriously impressive stuff. But, I'm also curious about the practical implications of this research. Like, what are some real-world applications of this approach to analyzing complex systems, besides just, blowing our minds, of course?
Well, one of the most promising applications is in neuroscience. Imagine using these techniques to analyze brain imaging data and uncover hidden patterns of information flow between different parts of the brain.
Whoa, that would be revolutionary. It could help us understand how the brain processes information, how different regions communicate and coordinate with each other. It would be like watching the brain think.
Exactly. And it could have huge implications for diagnosing and treating neurological disorders. We might be able to detect subtle disruptions in information flow that are characteristic of certain diseases, which could lead to earlier diagnoses and more targeted treatments.
That's incredible. And I bet this approach could be used in pretty much any field that deals with complex systems, not just neuroscience.
Oh, absolutely. Think about social networks, for example. We could analyze how information spreads through those networks, figure out who the key influencers are, understand how communities form and evolve, all sorts of things.
Or in finance. We could use these techniques to analyze market data, find patterns and connections that might help us make better investment decisions.
Exactly. And in environmental science, we could use this framework to study ecosystems, understand how different species interact, and identify those critical tipping points that might lead to an ecosystem collapse.
Wow, the possibilities are endless. It's like we've opened up a whole new way of seeing the interconnectedness of the world around us.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And as our tools and techniques continue to improve, we're only going to uncover more and more amazing insights. It's truly an exciting time to be exploring these ideas.
All right, let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, because this is a lot to process. We'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive and talk about some of the bigger questions this research has sparked. We're back. My brain is definitely feeling a little fried after all that. This paper is seriously intense.
I know, right? It's a lot to process. But it's also incredibly thought-provoking. This paper isn't just about math, it's about changing the way we see the world.
Exactly. So let's try to, distill all this information into some key takeaways for our listeners. What are the most important things you think they should remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this research is fundamentally changing how we study complex systems. It's shifting our focus away from analyzing individual parts in isolation and toward understanding the relationships between those parts.
Right, like we're finally realizing that the magic is in how the pieces fit together, not just in the individual pieces themselves.
Exactly. And the second big thing is that machine learning is a crucial part of this shift. It's giving us the tools to actually see those hidden patterns and connections that we might otherwise miss.
It's like we've been given a new set of lenses that let us see the world in a completely different way. And machine learning is constantly upgrading those lenses, giving us an even clearer view.
I like that. And as machine learning keeps getting better, those tools are only going to become even more powerful. We'll be able to see deeper and deeper into the inner workings of these systems. It's a really exciting time to be studying complexity.
Okay, before we wrap up, I got to ask, what's one big question that this paper has left you with? Something that's going to keep you thinking, long after we're done recording.
That's a good question. I think what really sticks with me is the idea that we might be able to use this approach to find early warning signs of system instability or collapse. If we can understand how information flow and organization change as a system gets closer to a critical tipping point, maybe we could actually intervene and prevent some catastrophic failures.
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought. It's like using information theory to predict the future.
Yeah, it's definitely ambitious, but I think it's possible. And if we could pull it off, it would revolutionize how we manage complex systems in every field you can think of, from ecology and economics to even human health.
That's amazing. Something to ponder for sure. And I bet our listeners have a ton of questions and ideas of their own after listening to this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to reach out and share your thoughts with us.
Please do. We love hearing from you.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this incredible exploration of complex systems in information theory. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep those brains buzzing. Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're going deep, really deep into the world of complex systems.
Very deep.
Yeah. We're talking spin systems, Sudoku puzzles. We're even going to talk about the structure of language a little bit later, but we're doing it all through the lens of this one research paper.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah. So this paper, it uses machine learning to kind of understand how information is shared and also hidden within these systems. And the way they do that is through these things called descriptions. Have you ever heard of descriptions?
I've heard of them, yeah. They're like little sneak peeks into the components of a system. Like, think of them as partial glimpses that actually can reveal some really surprising insights.
That's a great way to put it. And the paper delves into these familiar information theory concepts. Total correlation, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of that. But it also gets into some less common ones, like O information, which we're going to definitely unpack today.
Yeah, and what's really cool is this research, it kind of offers this unique perspective on complexity. Because instead of just looking at the whole system as one big blob, we're going to explore this vast space of possible descriptions. It's almost like we're mapping out a landscape of different ways to understand the same thing.
So the paper, it proposes this new way to study these systems by examining those different, like you said, descriptions. It almost feels like reverse engineering the system in a way.
Right. It is kind of like that. And each description, think of it as a specific way of compressing information about the system's parts. You choose which details you want to focus on, which ones are important.
It's kind of like if you were explaining something complex to like a friend, you know. You would prioritize certain aspects while leaving others out.
That's a perfect analogy.
Our brains do it all the time, right?
Yeah, we have to.
Because we can't hold everything. Okay, so get this. To find the best descriptions, the ones that really give us the juiciest insights, the researchers used neural networks.
Neural networks, yeah, they're powerful tools.
Yeah, the ones that either maximize or minimize these information-theoretic quantities.
It's wild how they apply machine learning to concepts like that.
It's super cool. It's super cool. So how do they actually do it? How do they optimize these descriptions using machine learning?
Okay, so they took information about each component and they encoded it. Then they use this thing called a loss function to kind of steer those neural networks. They're like, okay, find the descriptions that are the most interesting, the most informative, the ones that tell us something new.
That's fascinating. And they tested this on 3 different systems, right? A 5-spin system, a 4x4 Sudoku board, and then 4 grams, which are basically like 4-letter sequences in the English language.
Right.
And the results were pretty amazing in terms of what we can learn about information structure and how systems behave. So let's start with the 5-spin system. That's figure 1 in the paper for those who are following along.
Okay, so figure 1, it shows you this visual representation of the space, of all the possible descriptions you could have for the 5-spin system. And what they found was that the most integrated descriptions, so the ones that have high total correlation, and the most synergistic descriptions, the ones with low O information, they correspond to different subsets of spins.
Right, but they didn't stop there. The researchers connected this back to the Hamiltonian, the energy function of the system.
Absolutely. They actually defined a specific Hamiltonian with these coupling constants, G. And depending on whether those constants were positive or negative, it determines whether the interaction between spins I and J is ferromagnetic or antiferromagnetic, right?
Right, and that directly influences how information flows within the system.
Exactly.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So moving on, they actually gave us this formula for calculating the total correlation of a description U with respect to the system X.
Right, and it might look a little scary at first. It's TCU X, it's PERS, I, XU, but bear with me.
Okay, break it down for us. What does it all mean?
No problem. So You see that I, UA, that represents the mutual information between a single component Y and its representation UE in the description. And when you sum that over all n components, you get this measure of the total information about individual components that the description captures. Makes sense, right?
Okay, I'm following so far.
Great. Then we have this IXU, which is the mutual information between the entire system X and the whole description U.
And we subtract that. That's interesting.
Yeah, that subtraction is critical to understanding total correlation. It basically captures the difference between understanding the system as just a bunch of parts versus understanding it as a whole, as a single entity.
So a high total correlation basically means that you lose a lot of information when you switch from thinking about individual parts to thinking about the whole shebang.
Exactly. Like something is lost in translation, you know? And that usually means that the components are really interdependent. They rely on each other heavily.
That makes sense. Now, they also talked about O information, which has a more, intimidating equation.
It does look a bit intimidating. It's AU X plus NEI UE UU I.
Can you help us decipher that one too?
I'll try my best. Essentially, it tells you about the balance between redundant and synergistic information within a description.
Redundant versus synergistic.
Yeah. Like, is the information repeated in different parts of the description, or does it only become meaningful when you consider the whole system together?
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So that big summation term, that's where the magic happens.
You got it. That UA term, it's comparing the information content of one specific component I with the information content of the entire rest of the system, but leaving out component I.
So it's like, what does knowing about component I tell you about the system that you wouldn't know otherwise?
Exactly. If the difference between those two information values is positive, that means you've got redundancy. Knowing about I doesn't tell you anything new because that information's already hidden somewhere else in the description.
And if it's negative?
Then you've got synergy. It means component INL's information is only valuable when you see it in context with the rest of the system.
Wow. So O information tells us whether those interactions between components are working together or kind of doing their own thing.
Exactly. It helps us understand those emergent properties of the system, those things that only appear when you consider the whole picture.
That's fascinating. And the researchers, they took all of this and explored the space of descriptions for this 5-spin system, looking for those that maximized or minimized total correlation and O information. They were really pushing the boundaries of this information landscape.
Yeah, and the results are pretty visually striking, especially in Figure 1. You can see these different regions in the description space that correspond to these different information structures.
Right, and what's really cool is that they were able to link these structures to the actual physical interactions within the system. Like, they found that descriptions with high total correlation, they tend to group together those spins that have strong ferromagnetic interactions.
It makes sense, right? Because those spins are physically coupled and they're more likely to align in the same direction. They have the strong bond, so their information is more tightly interwoven.
Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the 4x4 Sudoku board. This one is a bit different because there aren't any physical connections between the squares, only these logical constraints.
That's right. It's the rules of Sudoku that create this web of information. And the researchers, they explored the space of possible descriptions for a 4x4 Sudoku board, looking for those that maximize or minimize O information.
And we see a similar visual representation in Figure 2, right? But the patterns here, they're much more intricate, more complex, reflecting the underlying logic of the board.
Exactly. And what they found was that the most redundant descriptions, those with high O information, involved conveying the same partial information about each square. They found these repeating patterns across the board where numbers were grouped based on certain shared properties.
It's like instead of saying, this square is a 1, this square is a 2, they're saying, these squares are all odd numbers, these squares are all even numbers.
Right, and they're visually clustered in these specific regions of the description space. And then there are the descriptions with low O information, those synergistic ones.
Those are the ones that reveal those hidden connections, right? Those that are hard to spot at first glance.
Exactly. Like, they highlight how knowing the value of one square can actually give you clues about other squares on the board, even if they're not next to each other.
One of the examples they gave involved communicating one single bit of information in 3 different ways, spread out across a row and a 2x2 square.
It's crazy, right? It's like the algorithm is learning the hidden logic of the game.
The logic that makes Sudoku so addictive. And it's all thanks to this machine learning approach.
Right. I mean, they mentioned that there are over 1,018 possible hard descriptions for a 4x4 Sudoku board. It's an astronomical number, but machine learning was able to pinpoint those descriptions that truly revealed the inner workings of the system.
That's truly remarkable.
Yeah.
And it shows the incredible potential of this approach.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we left off discussing those Sudoku boards and how machine learning uncovered those hidden information structures. It was fascinating.
It was really cool, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around like how they actually trained those neural networks to do all that. It seems almost like magic.
Yeah, it's not magic,
Yeah.
but it is pretty clever. They use this special type of neural network called an autoencoder. Have you heard of those?
I've heard the term, but I don't really know what it is.
Well, think of it this way. Autoencoders, they're designed to learn efficient representations of data. They have this sort of hourglass shape with an input layer, a compressed hidden layer, and then an output layer.
So they feed the system's data into that input layer, and the network learns to squish all that information down into a smaller representation in the hidden layer, and that becomes the description.
That's exactly it. That compressed representation in the hidden layer. That's your description of the system. And then the network tries to rebuild the original data from that compressed version, outputting it through that output layer.
It's like a game of telephone almost.
Yeah.
But the network is trying to get the message across as accurately as possible, even with that bottleneck in the middle.
That's a great way to think about it. And the training process, it's all about minimizing the difference between what went in and what came out, making sure the reconstruction is as accurate as possible.
So by forcing the network to go through this compression and reconstruction process, it learns to pick out and hold on to the most important information about the system.
Exactly. And the key to all of this is the loss function. They designed it not just to ensure that reconstruction was accurate, but to guide the network towards finding descriptions that maximize or minimize those information-theoretic quantities we talked about earlier, total correlation and O information.
Right, right. And you mentioned earlier that they use this technique called info-NCE to estimate mutual information. How does that fit into this whole autoencoder framework?
Good question. So info-NCE, it's actually integrated right into that loss function. Remember, mutual information, it measures how well you can predict one variable from another. And they used info-NC to train the network to be a good detective. Basically, I had to discriminate between positive examples and negative examples.
Okay, so positive examples, those are pairs of components and their representations that are genuinely related. And negative examples are just random pairings.
You got it. So by training the network to tell the difference between the real deal and the fakes, it could accurately estimate the mutual information between different parts of the system and the description.
Clever. So they could calculate total correlation and O information for the descriptions that the autoencoder learned.
Exactly. Now let's go back to their findings with the 5-spin system. Remember, they found that those descriptions with high total correlation tended to group spins with strong ferromagnetic interactions.
Yeah, and you said that makes sense because those spins are physically coupled. They like to align in the same direction.
Right, but what's really mind-blowing is that the neural network, through this whole compression and reconstruction thing guided by the loss function, it actually discovered this physical relationship all on its own.
So it wasn't explicitly programmed with any knowledge of ferromagnetism, but it still figured out that those spin groupings had high total correlation, meaning they share a lot of information.
It's like the network was uncovering the hidden rules of physics just by analyzing the data.
That's incredible. And the same principle applies to the Sudoku board, right?
Yep.
The network learned to identify those logical constraints of the game, even though it never actually learned the rules.
Exactly. It discovered that certain combinations of squares share a bunch of information, which led to those redundant descriptions with high O information.
And then those synergistic descriptions, the ones with low O information, they revealed those intricate chains of inference where information travels across the board in these unexpected ways.
Yeah, and the network learned all of this through that clever combination of the autoencoder architecture, the specially designed loss function, and that ingenious use of info-NCC to estimate mutual information.
Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about their analysis of language. They investigated 4 grams, those sequences of 4 letters in English, comparing those from 4-letter words and 8-letter words. What did they find there?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. They found that descriptions of four-letter words tended to have higher O information, indicating more redundancy in their information structure.
Wait, so shorter words have more redundant information than 4 grams from longer words? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, right? You'd think longer words would have more opportunities for repeated or overlapping information, but that's what makes this finding so cool.
It's like those shorter words are packing in more shared information per letter than their longer counterparts.
Exactly. It suggests that the constraints of forming meaningful words in English lead to a higher degree of redundancy in shorter words. Think about it. There are only so many possible four-letter words, so they're forced to reuse certain letter combinations more frequently.
So it's not just about the number of letters. It's about how those letters are combined to create these meaningful units of language.
Precisely. And that neural network, by analyzing those 4 grams, it was essentially cracking the code of the English language, revealing how information is structured and shared within this incredibly complex system.
It's like those neural networks are these little linguistic detectives uncovering the hidden patterns of language.
I like that analogy, and the implications of this research, they go far beyond just spin systems, the Sudoku boards, and 4 grams. This approach, it has the potential to revolutionize our understanding of complex systems across all sorts of fields.
Okay, so we've talked about how they did it. Now, let's dive into why is this research so groundbreaking? What are the potential applications?
That's the really exciting part. Let's start with medicine. Imagine using these tools to analyze a patient's genetic data, their medical history, their lifestyle, all to create a hyper-personalized treatment plan.
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
It might sound futuristic, but it's closer than you think. Let's say you have a patient with a particular disease. You could analyze their genetic data to pinpoint specific genes or pathways involved in that disease.
And by looking at their medical history, you could find patterns or correlations that suggest certain treatments might be more effective for patients with similar profiles.
Right, we're using this information-theoretic approach to find those hidden connections and patterns in the patient's data patterns that traditional methods might miss.
So you're combining those genetic insights with historical trends to create a treatment plan that's tailor-made for that individual based on their unique makeup and medical journey.
Exactly. It's taking personalized medicine to a whole new level, but it doesn't stop there. What about economics? How can we apply these techniques to something as complex and ever-changing as the global economy?
Economics, it's like trying to make sense of a giant anthill with millions of individual ants all running around doing their own thing.
I like that analogy. And just like with that anthill, there's a ton of information hidden within those individual interactions, information that can reveal insights into the overall behavior of the system.
But how do we extract those insights?
Yeah.
How can we use these information-theoretic techniques to make sense of all that economic chaos?
Think of economic agents, individuals, businesses, governments. They're all like components of this giant complex system. We can use the concept of descriptions to represent what each agent knows about the state of the economy.
So you're creating these compressed representations of each agent's knowledge and how they're likely to act based on what they know.
Exactly. And by analyzing those descriptions, we can start to understand how information flows through the economy, how different agents influence each other, and how all those interactions lead to these large-scale economic events like booms and busts.
So we could potentially use this to predict market crashes or design more effective economic policies.
It's certainly a possibility, but like with any complex system, there are always limitations and caveats. Economic systems are constantly evolving, and there's always a degree of uncertainty involved.
Of course, we can't predict the future with perfect accuracy, but even if we can just improve our understanding of these complex economic dynamics, that would be a huge step forward.
Absolutely. It's not just about predicting the future. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of how these systems work so we can make better decisions and create a more stable and prosperous world for everyone. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've come a long way, haven't we?
We have. In the last 2 parts, we explored how researchers used machine learning to reveal these hidden information structures within complex systems.
And we really dug deep into the math behind it all.
Yeah, those equations for total correlation and O information. They're kind of like the keys to unlocking the secrets of how information is shared and structured within a system.
And remember those 3 examples: the 5-spin system, the Sudoku board, and even the English language.
It's amazing how they applied those techniques to such different things and got such interesting results. But today, I want to look ahead.
The future. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, like how can we actually use these techniques to solve real-world problems? What's the practical impact of all this?
I think this research has the potential to completely change how we understand complex systems. I'm talking all sorts of fields: medicine, economics, social science, you name it.
Let's start with medicine. That seems like a really promising area.
Imagine being able to analyze a patient's entire medical history, their genetic data, lifestyle choices, everything, and then using all that to create a personalized treatment plan.
That sounds incredible, but how would that actually work? I mean, it sounds pretty futuristic.
It might sound like sci-fi, but it's closer to reality than you might think. Let's say you have a patient with a particular disease. You could analyze their genetic data to see which specific genes or pathways are involved.
And then, looking at their medical history, you could identify patterns or correlations that suggest which treatments have worked best for people with similar profiles.
Exactly. We're using this information-theoretic approach to find those hidden connections in the data. Connections that traditional methods might completely miss.
So it's combining genetic insights with historical data to create a treatment plan that's truly tailor-made, like one of a kind for that patient.
Precisely. It's personalized medicine taken to a whole new level.
Okay, that's medicine. But what about economics? That's a pretty complex system. How can we use this stuff to understand something as dynamic as the global economy?
Well, economics is all about how people make decisions and how all those decisions interact to create these large-scale patterns and trends.
Like a giant anthill, right? Millions of little ants all doing their own thing, but somehow it all works together.
Great analogy. And just like that anthill, there's tons of information hidden within those individual interactions. Information that can tell us a lot about how the entire system behaves.
So how do we get to that information? How do we apply this stuff to economics?
We can think of all those players in the economy. Individuals, companies, governments. We can think of them as the components of this huge complex system. And then we can use this concept of descriptions to represent the information that each one has about the state of the economy.
So you're basically creating these snapshots of what each player knows and how they're likely to act based on that knowledge.
Exactly. And when we analyze those descriptions, we can start to see how information is flowing through the economy, how different players influence each other, and how it all leads to those big economic events like, booms and busts.
Could we use this to, I don't know, predict things like market crashes or to design more effective policies?
It's definitely a possibility, but like with any complex system, there are limits. Economies are constantly evolving. There's always a degree of uncertainty.
You can't predict the future with 100% certainty.
Right, but even being able to improve our understanding of these economic dynamics would be huge.
Okay, medicine, economics. What about social science? How can these techniques help us understand something as complex and nuanced as human behavior?
Social science is all about interactions, how individuals interact, how they form groups, how those groups evolve. It's about understanding those dynamics that shape our societies and cultures.
So the human experience, really.
Exactly. And I think information theory gives us a really powerful way to study those interactions.
No, so?
It's like we did with economics. Think about those individuals in a social network as the components of this big complex system. We can use descriptions to represent the information they have about their social world.
So you're creating a map of who knows what and how that knowledge is spreading through the network.
Exactly. And by analyzing those descriptions, we can start to understand how social networks form and change, how information spreads, how opinions and behaviors evolve, how it all influences everything from political movements to the spread of new ideas.
So potentially, you could use this to study things like how social movements gain traction, how misinformation spreads, even things like designing public health campaigns.
Absolutely. The possibilities are really endless. And the exciting part is that we're only just scratching the surface of what we can do with this.
This has been an incredible journey. This research has really opened my eyes to a new way of looking at the world.
It's all about information, how it flows, how it's structured. It's the key to understanding ourselves and everything around us.
And as we develop more powerful algorithms and tools, we'll be able to tackle even more complex systems. Things like how the brain works, climate change, you name it.
It's an exciting time to be alive. So much is happening so quickly.
To all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, keep questioning.
And until next time, keep seeking knowledge.